Sometimes the things we stumble upon in life aren't accidents, they're appointments we never knew we'd made. Sarah Chen had sworn off storage unit auctions after the last one left her with boxes of moldy romance novels and a mannequin missing its head. But standing in the Tucson heat with her 8-month belly pressing against her ribs and her bank account showing double digits, she couldn't afford to be picky. The auctioneer's voice cracked like leather as he called for bids on Unit 47, a 10 by 12 space crammed with pristine white boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each one sealed with medical tape and numbered in black marker. "What kind of person stores medical supplies in the desert for God knows how long?" she muttered, raising her paddle for the winning bid of $47. It wasn't until she was alone in her garage that evening, box cutter trembling in her hand, that she realized she hadn't bought medical supplies at all. Inside the first box lay a tiny hospital bracelet, a grainy ultrasound photo, and a pair of white leather baby shoes that had never touched the ground. The name on the bracelet read, Baby Martinez, stillborn, June 15, 1987. But someone had lovingly placed these items here, as if waiting for a child to come home. How many other boxes held the same heartbreaking story, and why did every medical record bear the signature of a doctor who'd been dead for 30 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands shook as she set the baby shoes back in their tissue paper nest. The garage felt smaller suddenly, the towers of white boxes looming like silent sentinels in the amber light of her work lamp. She'd planned to power through at least a dozen boxes tonight, cataloguing whatever vintage treasures might save Desert Rose Vintage from another month of red ink. Instead, she found herself staring at the remnants of a life that never was. The ultrasound photo was yellowed at the edges, the thermal paper faded but still clear enough to make out the ghostly outline of a fully formed baby. 37 weeks, according to the notes scribbled in blue ink along the margin. Sarah's own daughter kicked against her ribs as if responding to the image, and she pressed a protective hand to her belly. "What were you doing in storage, little one?" she whispered to the photo. The medical records beneath told a clinical story that didn't match the tender care with which these items had been preserved. Fetal demise at 37 weeks gestation. No signs of distress noted during previous visits. Mother discharged following delivery. The signature at the bottom was an elegant flourish, Dr. Elena Vasquez, OB-GYN. Sarah knew that name. Everyone who'd lived in Tucson long enough knew it. Dr. Vasquez had been a local legend, the kind of doctor who delivered half the babies born in the 80s and never missed a Little League game for the kids she'd brought into the world. Her death in '89 had made the front page of the Arizona Daily Star. Car accident on Gates Pass, they'd said, tragic loss of a beloved physician. The box beside the first one seemed to pulse with its own gravity. Sarah's rational mind screamed at her to close everything up, return the boxes to storage, and forget she'd ever placed that winning bid. But her fingers were already working at the medical tape, peeling it away with the same careful precision Dr. Vasquez had used to sign death certificates 3 decades ago. Baby Thompson, stillborn, March 3, 1988. Another ultrasound, another perfect pair of unworn shoes, these ones yellow with tiny ducks embroidered on the toes, another set of medical records bearing the same elegant signature, describing another full-term baby who had simply failed to take that first breath. The garage air felt thick, heavy with more than just July heat. Sarah's vintage boutique occupied the ground floor of a converted house near the university, and she'd grown used to the desert's brutal summers, but tonight the temperature seemed to press against her like a living thing. She fumbled for her water bottle, taking long gulps while her baby girl performed what felt like gymnastics routines against her ribs. 2 boxes, 2 babies who should have lived but didn't. 2 families whose grief had somehow ended up for sale behind a strip mall that housed a check-cashing place and a store that sold nothing but different kinds of hot sauce. The third box felt heavier than the others, though logically Sarah knew they were all the same size. Her lower back ached as she hefted it onto her makeshift workspace, a folding table she'd bought at another auction, back when storage units held the kinds of treasures she'd expected. Vintage dresses and costume jewelry, and the occasional piece of mid-century furniture that could pay her rent for a month. Baby Chen, Sarah's box cutter, clattered to the concrete floor. The name on the hospital bracelet swam before her eyes, the black ink as clear as the day it had been printed. Baby Chen, stillborn, September 12, 1985. The date hit her like cold water. September 12th was her birthday. She'd turned 34 just last month, which meant, "No," she said aloud, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "No, no, no." But the ultrasound photo staring back at her told a different story. The same ghostly outline, the same careful measurements noted in familiar handwriting. And at the bottom, in the space reserved for the mother's name, someone had written Jennifer Chen in the same blue ink that had documented fetal demise. Jennifer Chen, her mother's name. Sarah sank into the lawn chair she kept in the garage for inventory nights, one hand clutching the bracelet, the other pressed protectively against her belly where her very much alive daughter continued her restless movements. Her mother had never mentioned another pregnancy, never spoken of a lost sibling. But here was the evidence, preserved with the same loving care as all the others, signed by a doctor who couldn't have signed anything because she'd been dead for 30 years. The boxes around her seemed to multiply in the shifting shadows, each one potentially holding another impossible secret. How many more babies were there? How many more families had stories they'd never been told? And why had someone gone to such lengths to preserve evidence of deaths that Sarah was beginning to suspect might not have been deaths at all? Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the garage door and sending dust devils dancing across the empty parking lot. But inside, surrounded by the accumulated grief of decades, Sarah Chen sat perfectly still and wondered if some auctions were less about buying someone else's discarded past and more about purchasing a key to secrets that were never meant to be unlocked. The baby shoes slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, landing with a soft whisper on the concrete floor. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she could only stare at them. Tiny white leather booties that should have taken first steps 34 years ago, the same day she had taken her first breath. Her phone buzzed against the folding table, the vibration abnormally loud in the thick garage air. A text from Marcus, her ex-husband. "Pick up Emma tomorrow at 2. Don't be late again." Even through the screen, she could feel his disapproval radiating across the 10 miles that separated their two very different lives. His new house in the foothills with its infinity pool and his new wife who had never struggled to make rent, never spent Saturday nights, elbow deep in other people's abandoned belongings, praying to find something valuable enough to keep the lights on. Sarah's hand trembled as she typed back, "Got it, Emma." Her 7-year-old daughter, who still believed Mummy's vintage store was the most magical place in the world, who spent weekends sorting costume jewelry into rainbow patterns and inventing stories about the previous owners of silk scarves and beaded purses. What would happen to those weekend visits if Desert Rose Vintage finally went under? Marcus had made it clear during the divorce proceedings that his lawyer would revisit custody arrangements if Sarah's financial instability persisted. The numbers didn't lie. 3 months behind on rent, 2 months behind on her business loan. The credit cards maxed out just to buy inventory that wasn't moving fast enough in the brutal summer heat that kept tourists away and locals indoors. She'd been counting on these boxes to contain her salvation, vintage designer pieces, maybe some mid-century furniture that the university professors loved, anything that could generate enough cash to buy her another month. Instead, she'd bought a mystery that made her skin crawl and her daughter kick restlessly against her ribs, as if the baby could sense her mother's growing unease. Jennifer Chen. Her mother's name written in careful cursive on medical records that couldn't possibly exist. Sarah pulled out her phone again, scrolling to her mother's contact. It was past 11, and Mom had always been an early-to-bed, early-to-rise type, especially since Dad's death 5 years ago, but this couldn't wait until morning. Her thumb hovered over the call button. What would she even say? "Hey Mom, funny story. I bought some storage unit boxes and found medical records suggesting you had a baby that died the same day I was born. Also, they're signed by a doctor who was already dead. Thoughts?" The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah winced. Her back ached from sitting in the lawn chair, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The garage around her held everything she'd managed to salvage from her old life: racks of carefully curated vintage clothing, boxes of jewelry she'd photographed and catalogued, the steamer she'd bought second-hand to refresh wrinkled dresses. This space represented 3 years of 18-hour days, of learning to navigate estate sales and auctions, of building something from nothing after Marcus had made it clear that being Mrs. Marcus Chen, wife of a successful real estate developer, was no longer her job. Desert Rose Vintage was supposed to be her independence, her proof that she could survive without Marcus's money, without his constant reminders that she'd never finished college, never had a real career. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd named the store after her own middle name, Rose, the name her mother had chosen to honor her Chinese grandmother. Now, staring at medical records bearing her mother's name, she wondered what other family stories had been carefully edited over the years. The other boxes loomed in her peripheral vision, white and identical and somehow accusatory. She'd paid $800 for their contents, money she couldn't afford to lose, scraped together from selling her grandmother's jade bracelet and skipping 2 prenatal appointments, because the copays had to go toward the storage unit deposit instead. $800 that should have bought her breathing room. Instead, it had bought her a sleepless night and questions that felt dangerous to ask. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was her landlord, Mr. Patterson, who owned the converted house where Desert Rose Vintage barely survived. "Sarah, need to discuss August rent. Call me Monday." The words blurred together on the screen. August rent. Due in 6 days. Another $1,200 she didn't have, couldn't pull from credit cards that were already screaming their limits. Outside, a car door slammed in the parking lot behind the strip mall. Sarah's head snapped up, suddenly aware of how isolated she was, how the nearest streetlight had burned out weeks ago. The logical part of her brain knew it was probably just someone leaving the 24-hour laundromat, but logic felt fragile when surrounded by evidence of babies who should have lived but didn't. She stood carefully, one hand supporting her lower back, and walked to the boxes she hadn't yet opened. 37 identical containers. If each one held the same impossible contents, then 37 families had been told their babies died under Dr. Elena Vasquez's care. 37 families who might never have known their children could have lived. Sarah's breath caught as footsteps echoed across the parking lot, deliberate and unhurried. Not the quick shuffle of someone heading home from the laundromat, but the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps stopped directly outside her garage. "Mrs. Chen?" The voice was female, professional, with the kind of careful neutrality that belonged to social workers and insurance adjusters. "I saw your light on. I'm sorry to bother you so late." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She glanced at the scattered medical records, the baby shoes lying abandoned on the concrete. "We're closed," she called out, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I'm not here about the store." A pause. "I'm here about the storage unit you purchased today. Unit 247. The words hit Sarah like ice water. She stood frozen, staring at the garage door that suddenly felt as thin as paper. Nobody should know about the auction, about what she'd found. She'd paid cash, signed paperwork with just her first name and phone number. The auctioneer had been more interested in moving through the units than collecting detailed buyer information. "I think you have the wrong person," Sarah said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. "Mrs. Chen, my name is Detective Lisa Martinez with Tucson PD. I'd like to speak with you about what you found in those boxes. Police. Sarah's legs went weak. She pressed her back against the folding table, sending several ultrasound photos fluttering to the floor. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was she in trouble for buying stolen goods? Had she stumbled onto a crime scene without realizing it? I need to see some identification, she managed. A badge appeared in the narrow window beside the garage door, illuminated by the streetlight from the next block over. It looked real, but Sarah had never seen a police badge up close. Detective Lisa Martinez, just like she'd said. Mrs. Chen, I understand this is frightening, but I promise you're not in any trouble. We've been monitoring that storage facility for months, waiting to see who would eventually purchase that unit. Monitoring it? Sarah's voice cracked. Why? Because those boxes contain evidence in a case that's been cold for 30 years. A case involving Dr. Elena Vasquez and approximately 40 missing infants. Missing, not stillborn, missing. Sarah's knees buckled and she gripped the edge of the table. The baby kicked frantically, as if responding to her mother's surge of adrenaline. The babies in these records, they're not dead? We believe many of them are very much alive, adults now, living their lives, most likely unaware that their birth certificates are forgeries and their real parents spent decades grieving children who weren't actually dead. The garage spun around Sarah. She thought of her own mother, alone in her small apartment, keeping Sarah's baby photos in neat albums and never once mentioning another pregnancy. Had Jennifer Chen spent 34 years believing she'd lost a child? Had she grieved for a baby who was supposed to be dead but was actually living, breathing, possibly even living in the same city? I found my mother's name, Sarah whispered. Baby Chen, stillborn September 12, 1985. Detective Martinez's silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if she'd stopped breathing. Finally, Mrs. Chen, I think we need to have this conversation face to face. Would you be willing to open the door? Sarah stared at the boxes surrounding her. Evidence, the detective had called them. Evidence of what? A conspiracy that had somehow continued operating even after Dr. Vasquez's death? Her hands shook as she realized the implications. If these babies had been stolen and sold, if their deaths had been faked, then someone had been running an illegal adoption ring. Someone who might still be alive. Someone who might not appreciate their secrets being dragged into the light. Mrs. Chen? Detective Martinez's voice carried a note of concern. Are you all right? No, Sarah thought. She wasn't all right. She was 8 months pregnant, financially desperate, and apparently in possession of evidence that could destroy dozens of families or save them, depending on how you looked at it. Her business was failing, her ex-husband was waiting for any excuse to challenge her custody, and she'd just learned that her mother might have been the victim of an elaborate and cruel deception. But as she looked at the baby shoes scattered across her garage floor, at the ultrasound photos that showed healthy babies who should have lived, she realized she had a choice to make. She could hand everything over to Detective Martinez and walk away. Return to her failing store, her mounting debts, her carefully small life. Or she could open that door and step into something that would change everything. Her daughter kicked once more, and Sarah made her decision. She reached for the garage door handle. Sarah's hand froze on the cold metal handle, her fingers trembling against the mechanism that would change everything. The weight of Detective Martinez's presence pressed through the thin garage door like summer heat, inescapable and suffocating. One simple motion, lift the handle, step back, let the door roll up, and there would be no returning to the careful smallness of her life. Her daughter kicked again, a sharp reminder of all the reasons to walk away. 8 months pregnant, behind on rent, Marcus waiting for any excuse to prove her unfit. The baby needed stability, needed a mother who wasn't chasing 30-year-old mysteries that could explode into something dangerous. Sarah pulled her hand back and pressed it against her belly instead. I need a minute, she called out, hating how her voice cracked. Of course. Take your time. But time was exactly what Sarah didn't have. Mr. Patterson's text about August rent glowed accusingly on her phone screen. 6 days to come up with $1,200, and instead of inventory she could sell, she'd bought boxes full of someone else's nightmares. The jade bracelet was gone, her last safety net sold for this storage unit gamble that had backfired spectacularly. She stared at the medical record bearing her mother's name, the careful handwriting that documented a death that might not have happened. Jennifer Chen had never mentioned losing a baby, never spoke of September 12th as anything but Sarah's birthday, a day of celebration and cake and carefully wrapped presents. Had she been protecting Sarah all these years, or protecting herself? The thought that made Sarah's chest tight with panic. What if opening this door meant losing her mother's trust? What if Jennifer had deliberately kept this secret, had reasons Sarah couldn't understand? Some wounds were meant to stay buried. Some families had edited their histories for good reasons. But then Sarah's eyes fell on the other boxes. 36 more families who might be living with lies, who might have spent decades grieving children who could still be found. How many mothers like Jennifer Chen were out there, carrying grief that might be unnecessary? Her phone buzzed. Another text from Marcus. Emma's asking about the baby again. Don't fill her head with unrealistic expectations about sibling relationships. Even through the screen, his disapproval felt sharp and familiar. Marcus, who had never understood why Sarah insisted on keeping her mother's maiden name as part of her business. Marcus, who thought Sarah's attachment to family history was sentimental nonsense that got in the way of practical decisions. He'd been thrilled when she'd finally sold the jade bracelet, saw it as Sarah finally growing up, finally choosing financial responsibility over emotional attachments. What would he say if he knew she'd spent that money on boxes full of medical records that could drag their family into a police investigation? What would his custody lawyer say? Sarah sank back into the lawn chair, overwhelmed by the weight of consequences she hadn't considered. Detective Martinez represented more than just answers. She represented court dates and media attention and questions Sarah might not be prepared to answer. The kind of chaos that could destroy what little stability she'd managed to build for Emma. The desert wind rattled the garage door, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed towards some other emergency. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine walking away, handing over the boxes, returning to Desert Rose Vintage, pretending this night had never happened. She could sell the remaining inventory, maybe find a job working for someone else's boutique. Smaller dreams, safer choices. But when she opened her eyes, the ultrasound photos were still scattered across her makeshift table, ghostly images of babies who should have taken first breaths. Her daughter's insistent movements reminded her of the difference between those still images and the vibrant life growing inside her. These babies in the records, if they were alive, they deserved to know. Their families deserved the truth. Mrs. Chen? Detective Martinez's voice carried a note of concern. I know this is overwhelming, but you're not alone in this. We have resources, protection protocols if needed. Protection protocols. Sarah's blood chilled as the implication hit her. If these boxes contained evidence of crimes, if people had been running illegal adoption rings for decades, then opening this door might put her family in danger. Not just financial danger, physical danger. She thought of Emma, 7 years old, and already asking careful questions about why Mummy's store wasn't busy anymore, why they'd moved to a smaller apartment, why Daddy's house had a pool but theirs didn't. Emma, who would start 2nd grade in 3 weeks and still believed the world was fundamentally safe, that mothers could protect their children from anything that mattered. Sarah's hand moved to the garage door handle again, then stopped. The metal felt warm now, heated by her palm and the weight of impossible choices. Behind the door waited answers that might heal decades-old wounds or tear open new ones. Behind the door waited Detective Martinez and questions that would change everything. But sitting in her garage, surrounded by evidence and doubt, Sarah realized the decision had already been made the moment she'd placed that winning bid. Some doors, once discovered, demanded to be opened. Sarah's fingers tightened around the handle, metal biting into her palm. The mechanism turned with a sharp click that seemed to echo through the garage like a gunshot. She stepped back, one hand braced against her lower back, and watched the door roll upward with a grinding mechanical protest. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain that would never fall. Detective Martinez stood silhouetted against the amber glow of the distant streetlight. A compact woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her badge glinted as she moved, but her hands remained visible and open, a gesture Sarah recognized as deliberate reassurance. "Thank you," Martinez said quietly. "I know this wasn't an easy choice." Sarah's throat felt desert dry. Now that the door was open, the garage looked different. Smaller somehow, the boxes looming larger under the harsh fluorescent light. The scattered medical records seemed to pulse with significance, evidence laid bare for someone who understood what it meant. "How did you know I bought the unit?" Sarah's voice sounded strange to her own ears, higher than usual. "We've had surveillance on the storage facility since March. Cameras, periodic checks on the lock." Martinez stepped carefully into the garage, her eyes sweeping over the open boxes with professional interest. "When the facility went into default and the auction was scheduled, we knew we had to be ready. We've been waiting 3 years for this." 3 years. Sarah felt suddenly dizzy, gripping the edge of the table. "You've known about this for 3 years and didn't do anything?" "Mrs. Chen, may I?" Martinez gestured toward the lawn chair Sarah had abandoned. When Sarah nodded, she pulled out a small notebook and settled into the chair with the ease of someone accustomed to conducting interviews in uncomfortable places. "We couldn't move on what we suspected. The original detective on this case, Detective Ray Morales, he'd been investigating Dr. Vasquez before her death in 1989. But when she died, the case went cold. No one wanted to chase ghosts, but you did." Martinez's smile was grim. "My mother was told her twin brother was stillborn in 1987. Dr. Elena Vasquez signed the death certificate." She paused, letting the words settle. "When I became a detective 15 years ago, I started asking questions, unofficially at first. What I found led me to that storage unit." Sarah's baby kicked sharply, as if responding to the tension crackling through the garage. She pressed her hand to the spot, feeling her daughter's restless movements. "Your uncle, do you think he's alive?" "I think there's a very good chance." Martinez leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Mrs. Chen, what you've stumbled into isn't just about falsified death certificates. We believe Dr. Vasquez was running a sophisticated adoption network, taking babies from vulnerable mothers, telling them the children died, then selling them to wealthy families who couldn't adopt through legal channels." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She thought of her mother, barely 19 in 1985, unmarried and pregnant in a time when that still mattered in small communities. Jennifer Chen had been vulnerable exactly the way Martinez described. Young, alone, probably terrified. "The families who bought the babies," Sarah whispered, "do they know?" Some might. Others probably believed they were adopting children whose birth mothers had voluntarily given them up. Clean paperwork, sealed records, no questions asked. Martinez's pen tapped against her notebook. But the birth mothers, they were told their babies died. They grieved. They never had the chance to make a real choice. Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the ultrasound photo from her mother's file. The grainy image showed a baby who looked healthy, fully formed. A baby who should have cried, should have nursed, should have lived. My mother never mentioned losing a baby, not once. Trauma does that sometimes, especially when there's no body to bury, no closure. Some mothers convince themselves it was a dream, a nightmare that couldn't have been real. The garage felt smaller with each passing moment, the weight of 37 boxes pressing down like a physical force. Sarah looked at Detective Martinez, this woman who had spent 15 years chasing the same ghosts, hoping for the same impossible answers. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. If I let you take the boxes, what happens to the families? To the people who might still be alive? We investigate carefully. We try to reunite families who want to be reunited. We try not to destroy the lives of people who've built their identities around stories that might not be true. Martinez's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the complexity of justice. But Mrs. Chen, you need to understand, once this starts, it won't be quiet. Media attention, court proceedings, people asking questions you might not want to answer. Sarah thought of Emma, of Marcus and his lawyers, of her mother's carefully edited family history. She thought of her failing business, and the rent she couldn't pay, and the baby who would arrive in less than a month. Every rational instinct screamed at her to hand over the boxes and walk away. But as she stood in her garage, surrounded by evidence of 37 stolen lives, Sarah realized she had already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The moment she'd opened that first box, she'd become part of this story. "Take them," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Take all of them." Detective Martinez didn't move to collect the boxes immediately. Instead, she studied Sarah with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust first impulses. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand what you're agreeing to. Once I take these boxes as evidence, there's no going back. You'll be interviewed multiple times. Your name will be in reports. If this goes to trial, and it probably will, you'll likely be called as a witness." Sarah's resolve wavered. She thought of Emma's school pickup line, how the other mothers might whisper if they saw her name in news reports. How long before it becomes public? Days, maybe a week. We'll try to control the narrative, but 37 missing children over a decade-long period? The media will circle like vultures. Martinez closed her notebook, sliding it into her jacket pocket. "There's something else you need to know. Dr. Vasquez didn't work alone. A conspiracy this sophisticated required help. Nurses, administrators, maybe even other doctors. Some of those people are probably still alive." The implication hit Sarah like ice water. "You think they're still operating?" "We don't know. But people who've spent 30 years covering up something this massive don't tend to give up easily." Martinez stood, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, has anyone contacted you about the storage unit? Phone calls, unexpected visitors, anything unusual?" Sarah's mind raced backward through the past 48 hours. The strange feeling of being watched at the auction. The way the other bidders had seemed to lose interest so quickly. There was a man at the auction. He bid against me initially, then just stopped. It felt odd. Martinez pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Can you describe him?" 60s, expensive suit despite the heat, salt and pepper hair, very precise. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to capture details she hadn't consciously noted. He had a medical alert bracelet, silver. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to listen carefully. If anyone approaches you about the boxes, anyone at all, you call me immediately. Don't engage, don't answer questions, just call." She handed Sarah a business card, the edges worn soft from handling. "Day or night?" Sarah stared at the card. Detective Lisa Martinez printed in clean black letters above a phone number that suddenly felt like a lifeline. "You think I'm in danger?" "I think you're the first break we've had in a very cold case, and that makes you valuable. It also makes you vulnerable." Martinez began moving toward the boxes, her professional mask slipping back into place. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow to give a formal statement. Bring any documentation you have about the storage unit purchase, receipts, auction papers, anything." As Martinez lifted the first box, Sarah felt a strange sense of loss. For 2 days, these records had been hers to protect, her burden to carry. Now they would disappear into evidence rooms and case files, becoming part of a machine much larger than her small life in Tucson. "My mother," Sarah said suddenly. "When do you tell her?" Martinez paused, box balanced against her hip. "That depends on what we find. If her baby survived, if we can locate him or her, we'll approach her carefully, with counseling support and time to process." She met Sarah's eyes. "Mrs. Chen, There's a chance your mother already knows. Some families were contacted over the years by people claiming to be their lost children. Sometimes it was real, sometimes it was elaborate cons. Sarah's phone buzzed insistently. Marcus again, the third call in an hour. My ex-husband is trying to reach me. Answer it. Act normal. Don't mention any of this yet. Sarah swiped to accept the call, Martinez's presence making her hyper-aware of every word. Hello, Marcus. Sarah, where the hell have you been? Emma's been asking about the sleepover Saturday, and you're not responding to texts. His voice carried the familiar edge of controlled irritation. Are you having another one of your episodes? Episodes. Marcus's dismissive term for what Sarah called intuition and what her therapist had gently labeled anxiety. I'm fine. Just busy with inventory. Right. The storage unit gamble. How did that work out? Please tell me you didn't buy someone else's junk for money we don't have. Sarah watched Martinez carry another box toward an unmarked sedan parked at the curb. 2 more officers had appeared to help, moving with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to collecting evidence in the middle of the night. It's complicated. It's always complicated with you, Sarah. Simple decisions become elaborate dramas. Marcus's sigh crackled through the phone. Emma wants to know if the baby will like the same movies she does. I told her not to get her hopes up about some perfect sister relationship. She's not even born yet, Marcus. Exactly my point. You're building fantasies again instead of dealing with reality. His voice softened slightly. Look, I'm not trying to be difficult, but Emma needs stability, especially with the new baby coming. These impulsive decisions of yours. I have to go, Sarah said, watching the last box disappear into the sedan's trunk. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up before Marcus could respond, his words echoing in the suddenly empty garage. Simple decisions become elaborate dramas. If only he knew how dramatically her simple storage unit purchase had just complicated everything. The garage felt cavernous now, stripped of its mysterious cargo. Sarah stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame for support, watching Detective Martinez's taillights disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across oil stains on the concrete floor, the only evidence that 37 boxes of secrets had ever existed. Her phone screen showed 3 missed calls from Marcus and a text that made her stomach clench. Emma's worried about you. Called twice, asking why you sound funny lately. We need to talk. Emma, 7 years old and already attuned to the subtle changes in her mother's voice, the way conversations ended too abruptly, the distraction that came with carrying other people's buried truths. Sarah closed the garage door with trembling fingers, sealing herself back into the suffocating Arizona night. Inside her small house, everything looked exactly the same. Emma's artwork still covered the refrigerator, bills still cluttered the kitchen counter, the nursery remained half-finished with paint cans stacked against one wall. But Sarah felt like she was seeing her life through glass, separated from normalcy by knowledge she couldn't unknow. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea with shaking hands, then sat at the kitchen table where Detective Martinez's business card lay like a small white flag of surrender. The detective's words echoed in the silence. People who've spent 30 years covering up something this massive don't tend to give up easily. Sarah's laptop sat open, cursor blinking in the search bar. Before she could stop herself, she typed Dr. Elena Vasquez Tucson 1989 car accident. The results loaded slowly, fragments of a life that had supposedly ended 30 years ago. Local news archives showed a brief obituary, survived by no family, memorial service at an unnamed chapel. The car accident had happened on a remote stretch of highway outside Phoenix. No other vehicles involved, no witnesses, too clean, too convenient. Her daughter kicked sharply, a reminder that some stories were still being written. Sarah rubbed the spot, trying to imagine explaining all of this to Emma someday. Mommy bought some boxes and accidentally uncovered a decades-old conspiracy involving stolen babies. It sounded insane, even in her own head. The house phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. Sarah stared at the caller ID, Unknown number, local area code. Martinez's warning played on repeat. If anyone approaches you about the boxes, anyone at all, you call me immediately. On the fourth ring, Sarah answered. Hello? Silence stretched across the line, punctuated only by the faint sound of traffic in the distance. Then, a voice, elderly, male, carefully modulated. Mrs. Chen, I believe you've come into possession of something that doesn't belong to you. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Her free hand fumbled for Martinez's card, fingers closing around it like a talisman. I'm sorry. Who is this? Someone who spent a very long time making sure certain secrets stay buried. The voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You're in a delicate condition, Mrs. Chen. It would be unfortunate if stress affected your pregnancy. The threat landed with surgical precision. Sarah's hand moved protectively to her belly, maternal instinct overriding everything else. What do you want? I want you to remember that some truths are more dangerous than lies. Some families have found peace in carefully constructed stories. Would you really destroy that peace for the sake of satisfying your curiosity? Sarah thought of the ultrasound photos, the tiny hospital bracelets, the mothers who had grieved children who might still be alive. Those families deserve to know. Do they? The man's chuckle was dry as desert wind. Mrs. Chen, you're about to become a mother. Ask yourself, would you want someone to shatter your child's understanding of who she is? Would you want to destabilize everything she believes about her origins? The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the phone with Martinez's card crushed in her other hand. The house suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Every shadow could hide someone watching. Every sound could signal approach. She dialed Martinez's number with shaking fingers. It rang twice before the detective's professional voice answered, Martinez. Someone called, Sarah whispered, moving to the front window to peer through the blinds. The street looked empty, but appearances could be deceiving. About the boxes. He knew my name, knew I'm pregnant. Are you safe? Do you see anyone outside? I don't know. I don't think so. Sarah's voice cracked. He said some families have found peace in lies, that I'd be destroying everything for curiosity. Mrs. Chen, listen to me. Lock your doors, close all blinds, don't answer the door for anyone except uniformed police. I'm sending a patrol car to watch your house tonight. This is really happening, Sarah said, more to herself than to Martinez. This is really dangerous. Yes, it is. But you did the right thing. Those families deserve the truth, even if it hurts. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her dark kitchen, feeling her daughter's restless movements and wondering if she'd just traded her family's safety for justice she might never live to see delivered. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in her kitchen chair as the hours crawled toward dawn, watching shadows shift across the blinds and jumping at every settling creak of the house. The patrol car Martinez had promised arrived at 3 a.m., a silent white presence that should have been comforting, but only made everything feel more real, more dangerous. Her phone buzzed constantly. Marcus calling again. Emma's school sending automated reminders about picture day. Normal life demanding attention while Sarah's world tilted on its axis. She couldn't answer. How do you discuss lunch money and permission slips when someone has just threatened your unborn child? At 7 a.m., her daughter kicked hard enough to make Sarah gasp. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing her mother's terror. Sarah pressed both hands to her belly, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. It's okay, little one. Mommy's going to keep you safe. But how? The man on the phone had known exactly where to strike, not at Sarah's curiosity or conscience, but at her deepest maternal fears. The threat hadn't been explicit, but the message was crystal clear: back off, or risk everything. The morning news played softly on her phone, local anchors discussing traffic and weather with cheerful oblivion. Sarah found herself studying every face on screen, wondering if any of these people, reporters, politicians, business leaders, had been stolen babies 30 years ago. How many Tucson families were built on Dr. Vasquez's lies? Marcus's latest text was more urgent. "Sarah, I'm coming over. Emma's scared and so am I. You're not acting like yourself." He was right. The Sarah from a week ago would never have bought a mysterious storage unit. She would never have called police about medical records that weren't her business. That Sarah paid bills and attended PTA meetings and worried about normal things like inventory and rent money. This Sarah was dangerous to her family. The knock came at 8:30, not the aggressive pounding of threats, but Marcus's familiar pattern. Sarah looked through the peephole, seeing her ex-husband's concerned face distorted by the lens. Behind him, Emma waited in the car, her small hands pressed against the window. Sarah's heart shattered. Her daughter shouldn't see patrol cars parked outside their house. Emma shouldn't have to wonder why Mummy sounded scared, why adults whispered and phones rang at strange hours. She opened the door to Marcus's immediate assessment, his lawyer's eyes cataloguing her unwashed hair, yesterday's clothes, the exhaustion she couldn't hide. "Jesus, Sarah, what's going on?" "I can't." Sarah's voice broke. "It's complicated." "Everything's complicated with you lately." But his tone was worried rather than angry. "Emma thinks the baby is making you sick. She wanted to bring you her stuffed elephant, the one that helps when she has nightmares." Through the window, Sarah saw Emma holding the small grey elephant that had comforted her through thunderstorms and first day of school fears. The sight broke something inside her chest. "Marcus, I need you to take Emma somewhere safe." His expression sharpened. "Safe from what?" "I can't tell you, but please, maybe your mother's house in Phoenix. Just for a few days." "Sarah, you're scaring me. If you're having some kind of breakdown—" "I'm not having a breakdown." The words came out sharper than intended. Sarah lowered her voice, acutely aware of the patrol officer who might be listening. "I found something important, and now people want me to pretend I never saw it." Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to lawyer mode, controlled, probing. "What kind of something?" Sarah thought of the ultrasound photos, the hospital bracelets, the babies who should have lived. She thought of Detective Martinez's uncle, possibly alive somewhere, and her own mother's carefully edited history. She thought of 37 families destroyed by one woman's greed. "The kind that changes everything," she whispered. Emma tapped on the car window, pointing at the house with obvious impatience. Marcus glanced back at their daughter, then at the patrol car, pieces clicking into place. "Sarah, are you in some kind of legal trouble?" "Not the kind you're thinking." Sarah pressed her hand to her belly as the baby shifted restlessly. "But yes, trouble." Marcus studied her face with the intensity that had made him good at reading juries. Whatever he saw there convinced him. "Okay, I'll take Emma to Mom's, but Sarah, if you're in danger, if something happens to you or the baby—" "Nothing's going to happen," Sarah said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "I just need a few days to figure things out." After they left, Sarah stood in her empty house, listening to silence that felt like anticipation. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Smart choice. Keep making smart choices." She was being watched, every decision monitored, every move calculated for its threat level. Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, finally understanding what Detective Martinez had tried to tell her. This wasn't just about old medical records or cold cases. This was about power, and people who would kill to keep it. The text arrived at 9:47 a.m., just as Sarah was trying to convince herself that Emma was safer away from this nightmare. Detective Martinez unavailable. Case reassignment pending. Do not contact police again. Sarah stared at the message, her blood turning to slush. She dialed Martinez's number with trembling fingers, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. The business card that had felt like a lifeline 12 hours ago was now just paper and ink. They had gotten to Martinez. Somehow, impossibly, the conspiracy Sarah had uncovered reached deep enough into the system to silence a detective mid-investigation. 37 boxes of evidence, gone. The one person who had believed her, neutralized. Sarah was completely alone. Her phone rang, Marcus's ringtone. She answered without thinking, desperate for any familiar voice. "Sarah, we have a problem." Marcus's words came fast, lawyer sharp with controlled panic. "Someone called my office, asked about your mental health history, your fitness as a mother. They claim to be from Child Protective Services." The kitchen tilted around her. Sarah gripped the counter, fighting waves of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd call CPS directly to verify, but Sarah, when I called the real CPS, they had no record of any investigation. Someone's building a case against you. Someone with enough knowledge of the system to fake credentials. They were going to take her baby." The realization hit like a physical blow, not just her unborn daughter, but Emma too. They would paint Sarah as an unstable single mother, obsessed with conspiracy theories, dangerous to her children. Who would question it? She had no evidence now, no detective to back up her story, nothing but the word of a pregnant woman against institutional power. "Marcus, you have to keep Emma away from me." "What?" "Sarah, no. Listen to me." Sarah's voice cracked. "Whatever they're planning, whatever story they're building about my mental state, it'll be easier to sell if I have access to Emma. Keep her at your mother's. Tell everyone I'm having pregnancy complications, that the doctor ordered bed rest." "Sarah, you're not making sense. Who is they? What story?" How could she explain that she'd stumbled into a decades-old network of stolen babies and falsified deaths? That somewhere in Tucson, people with enough power to silence police detectives were deciding her fate? Marcus would think she was having a breakdown, exactly what they wanted. "I found something," she said finally. "Medical records that prove babies were stolen in the 1980s. The people responsible are still alive, still protecting their secret." Silence stretched across the line. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried the careful tone he used with hostile witnesses. "Sarah, that sounds crazy. I know how it sounds." Sarah pressed her free hand to her belly, feeling her daughter's movements slow as if sensing distress. "But they killed a detective, Marcus. They're watching my house. They threatened our baby." "Okay." The word came out too careful, too measured. "Okay, Sarah. Why don't you come to Phoenix? We can figure this out together." She could hear it in his voice, the shift from concern to management mode. Marcus thought she was having a breakdown. In less than 24 hours, they had isolated her so completely that even her ex-husband believed she was mentally unstable. "I can't leave," Sarah whispered. "They're watching." "Who's watching, Sarah? The patrol car? That's there to help you." Sarah looked out the window. The patrol car was gone. When had it left? Had it ever been real or just another part of their psychological campaign? Her laptop chimed with an email notification. Sarah's blood froze as she read the sender, Tucson Memorial Hospital. The subject line was simple: "Regarding your upcoming delivery." With shaking hands, she opened the message. "Dear Ms. Chen, due to recent concerns about your mental health status, we're recommending immediate psychiatric evaluation. Please report to our emergency department for assessment. Failure to comply may result in protective custody of your newborn upon delivery. Dr. Michael Reeves, Chief of Psychiatry." "No," Sarah breathed. "No, no, no." "Sarah, what's wrong?" She couldn't tell Marcus about the email. He would drive straight to Tucson, convince her to go to the hospital voluntarily. They would commit her, claim postpartum psychosis, take her baby, another child disappearing into their system, another family destroyed. "I have to go," Sarah said. "Sarah, wait." She hung up and turned off the phone. Outside, a black sedan cruised slowly past her house. Too slowly, windows too dark. Sarah backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. They had won. In less than 12 hours, they had dismantled her life with surgical precision. No evidence, no allies, no credibility, just a pregnant woman alone in an empty house, waiting for them to take everything she had left. Her daughter kicked weakly, and Sarah realized with crushing certainty that she might never get to hold her baby at all. Sarah stared at the hospital email, the words blurring as her panic reached critical mass protective custody. They weren't just planning to discredit her. They were going to steal her baby the same way Dr. Vasquez had stolen 37 others. The black sedan made another pass, slower this time. Sarah's hands shook as she closed the laptop, her mind racing. She needed proof, something concrete that even they couldn't dismiss or destroy. Something that would... The boxes. Sarah's breath caught. She had photographed everything before giving the originals to Martinez. The images were still on her phone's cloud storage, backed up automatically. They might have silenced the detective and made the physical evidence disappear, but they couldn't erase what she'd already documented. With trembling fingers, she powered her phone back on, ignoring the cascade of missed calls and texts. She opened her photo gallery, scrolling past recent pictures of Emma until she found them, dozens of images showing medical records, birth certificates, ultrasound photos, proof that 37 babies had been stolen. But as she stared at the photographs, a detail she'd missed before jumped out at her. One of the birth certificates was partially visible beneath another document, and the attending physician's signature was different. Not Dr. Elena Vasquez, but someone else entirely, Dr. Michael Reeves, the same Dr. Reeves who had just signed the psychiatric evaluation order. Sarah's world tilted. She zoomed in on the photograph, her heart pounding as the signature came into focus. The handwriting was unmistakably the same as the email signature, the careful, precise penmanship of someone who had been forging documents for decades. Dr. Vasquez hadn't worked alone. She'd had a partner, someone still alive, still practicing medicine at Tucson Memorial, someone with the authority to sign psychiatric holds and the power to take newborns into protective custody. The conspiracy wasn't a relic from the 1980s. It was ongoing, active, protected by institutional power that reached into hospitals and police departments. And Sarah had walked directly into their crosshairs. Her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number, last warning. Report to the hospital voluntarily or we'll come get you. Sarah looked around her kitchen, Emma's artwork on the refrigerator, the half-finished nursery visible through the doorway, the life she'd built from nothing after her divorce. In 12 hours, they would take all of it. They would declare her mentally incompetent, seize her baby, and probably find some way to remove Emma from her custody permanently. Unless she disappeared first. The thought struck like lightning. She had maybe 6 hours before they sent an ambulance with psychiatric technicians and court orders. 6 hours to vanish completely, to go somewhere they couldn't find her until she figured out how to expose the truth. But where could she go? They knew about Marcus. Probably had people watching his mother's house in Phoenix. They'd demonstrated enough reach to silence a police investigation. Sarah's credit cards, her car's GPS, even her phone. Everything could be tracked. She needed help from someone completely outside the system. Someone they wouldn't think to monitor. Maria Gonzalez. The storage unit facility manager had been sympathetic, had even expressed curiosity about what Sarah might find in the boxes. More importantly, Maria had mentioned family in Mexico, relatives who moved frequently for work, people who lived under the radar by necessity, who understood how to become invisible when survival required it. Sarah grabbed her purse and the few $100s in cash she kept for emergencies. She deleted the photos from her phone, but not from the cloud. They could track her device, but the evidence would remain safe as long as her account stayed active. The back door opened onto her small yard, surrounded by a wooden fence that blocked the view from the street. Sarah slipped out, moving carefully along the fence line until she reached the gate that opened onto the alley behind her house. She'd used this route countless times while pregnant, a shortcut to avoid the front steps when her back ached. The alley was empty, baking in the Arizona sun. Sarah walked quickly toward the main street, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Every car engine made her jump. Every shadow could hide someone watching. But as she reached the corner, something shifted in her chest. Not just fear anymore, but rage. These people had stolen babies for decades, destroyed families, built careers on systematic cruelty. They thought they could silence her the same way they'd silenced Martinez by making her disappear into their system. They were wrong. Sarah flagged down a taxi, giving the driver directions to the storage facility. As Tucson blurred past the windows, she felt her daughter kick strongly, as if in agreement. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about protecting her child from becoming another entry in their files. The revolution would begin with a pregnant woman who refused to disappear. The taxi dropped Sarah at the storage facility's front gate, where the desert sun had already begun its merciless assault on the cracked asphalt. She paid the driver with cash, watching the yellow cab disappear into the heat shimmer before turning toward the office trailer, where Maria Gonzalez managed the maze of metal units behind them. The bell above the door chimed as Sarah entered, and Maria looked up from paperwork with immediate concern. "Senora Chen? You look terrible. Is the baby? I need help." The words tumbled out before Sarah could second-guess them. "I'm in trouble, and I don't have anywhere else to go." Maria set down her pen, studying Sarah's face with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen desperation before. The facility attracted people in transition, people running from something or starting over. Maria had learned to read the difference between temporary setbacks and genuine danger. What kind of trouble? Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her daughter had been unusually quiet during the taxi ride. "The things I found in those boxes, someone wants to make sure I never tell anyone about them. They're trying to have me committed so they can take my baby." The words sounded insane even to her own ears, but Maria's expression remained steady. She reached under the counter and pulled out a bottled water, handing it across to Sarah. "Drink, then sit down and tell me everything." The kindness in her voice nearly broke Sarah's composure. For the past 12 hours, everyone who should have helped her had either disappeared or turned against her. Finding someone willing to simply listen felt like discovering water in the desert. Sarah sank into the plastic chair beside Maria's desk, the cool air conditioning a relief after the scorching walk from the street. Between sips of water, she told the story. The medical records, Detective Martinez's sudden silence, the psychiatric evaluation order that would strip away her parental rights. Maria listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as pieces clicked into place. "My cousin Luis works maintenance at Tucson Memorial," Maria said when Sarah finished. "He's mentioned Dr. Reeves before, says the man has too much power, makes decisions that don't sit right, never enough to prove anything, but—" She shrugged. "Sometimes you know something's wrong even when you can't name it." The validation hit Sarah like physical relief. Someone else had noticed. She wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining conspiracies where none existed. The wrongness she'd sensed was real, had been observed by others who lacked only the evidence to act. "They'll be looking for me soon," Sarah said. "I can't go home, can't contact my family. I need to disappear long enough to figure out how to prove what's happening." Maria was quiet for a long moment, fingers drumming against the desk as she weighed options. Finally, she reached for her phone. "My brother Tomas runs a construction crew. They're working a job site outside the city, new houses going up in the desert, empty ones, just frames and drywall, but they have running water and electricity. Maria, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Maria's tone brooked no argument. "You think you're the first pregnant woman to need somewhere safe to think? My own daughter had to disappear for 3 months when her ex-husband started making threats. Family helps family, even when we're not blood." The simple declaration hit Sarah harder than all the threats and manipulations of the past day. Here was someone willing to risk herself for a stranger's safety, someone who understood that survival sometimes required stepping outside the system entirely. Maria made the call in rapid Spanish, explaining the situation to her brother. Sarah caught enough words to understand: embarazada, pregnant, peligro, danger, ayuda, help. When Maria hung up, she was already reaching for her car keys. "Tomas says there's a house on the east edge of the development. Foundation and walls finished, but no windows installed yet. Cool in the mornings and evenings, and nobody goes there except his crew during working hours." As they drove through Tucson's sprawling suburbs toward the desert, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since opening the first box: hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that had led her to trust Detective Martinez too quickly, but something steadier, the hope that came from finding unexpected allies, from discovering that courage could be contagious. "We need a plan," Sarah said, watching the city give way to construction sites and desert scrub. "Evidence they can't destroy, people they can't silence." "Luis gets off shift at 6, Maria replied. "He's worked at the hospital for 15 years, knows which doctors have clean records and which ones don't. If Dr. Reeves has been doing this for decades..." Someone's noticed. Sarah's daughter kicked suddenly, a strong movement that felt like agreement. The baby, who had been so still during the morning's crisis, now seemed energized, as if sensing that her mother had stopped running and started fighting. For the first time in hours, Sarah smiled. They wanted her to disappear into their system, to become another voiceless victim in their decades-long conspiracy. Instead, she was about to become their worst nightmare, a mother with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The skeletal house rose from the desert like a promise half-kept. Wooden frames outlined rooms that would never hold the families they were designed for, at least not yet. Sarah followed Maria through what would eventually be a front door, stepping into a living room where late afternoon light slanted through empty window frames, casting geometric shadows across the concrete floor. "The crew starts at 7, breaks for lunch around noon, and leaves by 3 to beat the worst heat," Maria explained, setting down the grocery bags she'd insisted on buying during their stop in town. "You'll have privacy from 4 until morning." Sarah ran her hand along a wall stud, feeling the rough wood grain beneath her palm. The house smelled of sawdust and possibility, honest scents that felt cleaner than the antiseptic corridors of Tucson Memorial, where her fate was being decided. Here, surrounded by the tools and materials of construction rather than destruction, she could finally think clearly. "I can't keep running," Sarah said, more to herself than to Maria. "Even if I stay hidden until the baby comes, they'll be waiting. They have resources, patience, institutional power. Eventually they'll find us." Maria unpacked bottled water and sandwiches onto a makeshift table formed by sawhorses and plywood. "So what's the alternative?" "We finish this." The words surprised Sarah with their certainty. "We expose the whole network before they can take my daughter, not just Dr. Reeves, but everyone who's been protecting this conspiracy for 30 years. The commitment felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like finally standing up straight after months of bending under pressure. Since opening those first boxes, Sarah had been reacting to discoveries, to threats, to the dissolution of her normal life. But reaction wasn't enough anymore. They had pushed her past the point where survival meant staying quiet. Maria nodded slowly. "Luis should be home by now. I'll call him, see what he knows about Reeves and who he works with." While Maria made the call, Sarah walked through the unfinished house, her footsteps echoing in empty rooms. The master bedroom looked out toward the Catalina Mountains, purple in the distance. She imagined families who would live here someday, children growing up safe, parents who never had to question whether their babies would be stolen in delivery rooms, whether their love was enough to protect what mattered most. Her daughter shifted in her womb, a gentle reminder of what was at stake. Not just the 37 babies from the storage unit boxes, not just the families destroyed across decades of systematic theft, but every child yet to be born into Dr. Reeves's web of institutional power. How many more would disappear if Sarah chose silence over justice? "Luis says the night shift supervisor in labor and delivery has been asking questions about Dr. Reeves for months," Maria reported, returning from her phone call. "Apparently there have been irregularities, women brought in by ambulance with no medical history, deliveries with incomplete documentation. But when she tried to report it, her concerns mysteriously disappeared from the system." Sarah felt the familiar chill of recognition. The same systematic erasure that had made Detective Martinez's investigation vanish, the same institutional protection that had allowed the conspiracy to flourish for decades. But this time, someone inside the system was noticing the patterns. "What's her name?" Sarah asked. Angela Torres. She's worked obstetrics for 20 years, started questioning things when her own niece was born there last year. Something about the way Dr. Reeves handled the delivery felt wrong, but she couldn't prove anything. A plan began forming in Sarah's mind. Dangerous, but possible. If we could get Angela the evidence from my photos, the birth certificates, the medical records, she'd have the inside knowledge to understand what they prove. More importantly, she'd have access to current hospital records that might show the pattern continuing. That's assuming she's willing to risk her career, Maria pointed out. Going up against a chief of staff isn't exactly a safe career move. No, Sarah agreed, but being complicit in baby trafficking isn't exactly safe for her conscience either. Sometimes people are just waiting for someone else to be brave first. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah's phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 unread messages, a digital storm of people trying to track her down. Marcus, her mother, numbers she didn't recognize, all part of the net closing around her former life. But looking out at the vast Arizona landscape, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the absolute clarity that came with having nothing left to lose. They had already taken her business, her credibility, her safety. They were planning to take her children. The only thing left was the choice between submission and war. Sarah Chen, 8 months pregnant and armed with nothing but photographs and fury, chose war. "Call Luis back," she told Maria. "Ask him to set up a meeting with Angela Torres. Tell her a woman with evidence about Dr. Reeves needs help bringing him down." In the distance, coyotes began their evening song, wild voices calling across the desert darkness. Luis arrived at dawn, his truck kicking up dust clouds as it navigated the construction site's rutted access road. Sarah had spent the night in the skeletal house, dozing fitfully on the air mattress Maria had brought, her daughter's increasingly active movements making real sleep impossible. The baby seemed to sense the approaching confrontation, responding to Sarah's adrenaline with restless kicks and turns. "Angela will meet you," Luis reported, accepting the coffee Maria had brought in a thermos. But not at the hospital. Too many eyes, too many people loyal to Reeves. She suggested the old missions district, San Xavier del Bac, tourist crowds, multiple exit routes and sacred ground. Even Reeves won't start trouble there. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the printed photographs Maria had helped her organize the night before. 37 babies' worth of evidence, arranged chronologically to show the pattern spanning decades. Birth certificates with forged signatures, medical records documenting impossible stillbirths, hospital bracelets that should have stayed with living children forever. "She knows this is dangerous?" Sarah asked. "Angela's been dangerous her whole career," Luis replied. First woman to become night supervisor at Memorial, first to challenge the old boys network when they tried to silence her about safety violations. She didn't get where she is by avoiding fights. The description offered some comfort, but Sarah's mind kept circling back to Detective Martinez, another institutional insider who had seemed ready to fight right until the moment he disappeared. How many people had thought themselves safe before discovering the true reach of Dr. Reeves's protection? "There's something else," Luis continued, his expression darkening. "Angela did some checking after our call last night. She pulled records going back to when Reeves first joined the staff. The pattern isn't random, Sarah. He targets specific women, single mothers, immigrants, women with limited family support, people who won't be believed if they try to report what happened." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Sarah had assumed she'd stumbled into the conspiracy by accident, that buying the storage unit had been random misfortune. But now she wondered if her vulnerability had made her a target from the moment she'd started showing at local medical appointments. A struggling single mother, recently divorced, no family nearby, exactly the profile Luis was describing. "They've been watching me," she realized aloud, "planning this since they knew I was pregnant." Maria's face hardened. All the more reason to end it today. Angela asked me to tell you something else. She's not the only one with suspicions. There's a group of nurses, social workers, even a few doctors who've been quietly documenting irregularities for months. They just needed someone brave enough to go first. The weight of representation settled on Sarah's shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for her own daughter anymore, but speaking for everyone who had noticed the wrongness and lacked only the evidence to act. The responsibility was crushing but also oddly liberating. If she was going to risk everything, at least she wasn't risking it alone. By 8 o'clock, they were driving toward the mission, the morning sun already promising another brutal day. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of Maria's car, the folder of evidence clutched against her chest like armor. Her daughter had finally settled into stillness, as if sensing the need for stealth. San Xavier del Bac rose from the desert like a white mirage, its Spanish colonial architecture defiant against the harsh landscape. Tour buses were already disgorging visitors, creating the crowds that would provide cover for their meeting. Sarah spotted Angela immediately, a compact woman in scrubs, standing near the mission's entrance with the alert posture of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Senora Chen?" Angela's handshake was firm, professional. "Luis tells me you have evidence about the baby trafficking." The directness was startling. No euphemisms, no careful dancing around the truth. Here was someone who had already accepted the full horror of what they were dealing with. 37 cases spanning 3 decades, Sarah confirmed, offering the folder, all involving Dr. Reeves and his partner, Dr. Vasquez, all reported as stillbirths, but the evidence suggests the babies lived. Angela opened the folder, her expression growing grimmer with each photograph. Around them, tourists chatted about architecture and history, oblivious to the documentation of systematic evil being reviewed in their midst. "This matches what we've been seeing in current cases," Angela murmured. "The same patterns, the same suspicious circumstances. Dr. Reeves has been getting bolder, more frequent. We think he's preparing for retirement, trying to complete as many transactions as possible before he leaves." The clinical language couldn't mask the rage in Angela's voice. Sarah recognized it, the fury that came from watching evil flourish under institutional protection, from being forced into complicity by systemic silence. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Angela closed the folder and looked directly into Sarah's eyes. "We destroy him, today, before he can take your baby or anyone else's." The mission bells began to ring, calling faithful to morning services. But Sarah heard something else in their bronze voices, a battle cry, summoning warriors to the final confrontation. The plan Angela outlined was audacious in its simplicity. Reeves is scheduled for surgery at 2 p.m., a high-profile case, city council member's wife. Half the hospital board will be watching from the gallery. He can't disappear or make excuses when we present the evidence publicly. Sarah's stomach lurched, and not from pregnancy. "You want to confront him during surgery?" "Right after. When he's still in scrubs, still playing the role of respected physician. In front of witnesses he can't intimidate or silence." Angela's eyes burned with decades of suppressed fury. "I've been watching him destroy families for 20 years. Today, it ends." They drove to the hospital in separate cars, Sarah's hands trembling on the steering wheel as she followed Angela's sedan through Tucson's midday traffic. The building loomed ahead, all glass and steel authority, the place where her nightmares had begun, but now, instead of running from it, she was driving toward the heart of the conspiracy. Angela met her at the staff entrance, producing ID badges that would get them through security. "You're Dr. Martinez, consulting specialist," she explained, clipping a badge to Sarah's shirt. "Stay close, keep quiet, and let me handle the talking until we reach the surgical floor." The familiar antiseptic smell hit Sarah like a physical blow as they entered the hospital corridors. Her daughter responded immediately, kicking hard enough to make Sarah gasp. Even in the womb, the baby seemed to recognize the danger of this place. They rode the elevator in silence, surrounded by residents and nurses discussing cases in medical shorthand. Sarah caught fragments. blood pressure readings, medication dosages, the routine language of healing that Dr. Reeves had perverted into something monstrous. How many of these people knew? How many had noticed the patterns and chosen institutional loyalty over justice? "He's finishing up now," Angela murmured, checking her phone as they reached the surgical floor. "Give me the folder. When I signal, start recording with your phone. We need documentation of his reaction, proof that he recognizes the evidence." Through the observation gallery windows, Sarah could see Dr. Reeves at work, his hands steady as he sutured an incision. He looked exactly as she remembered. Distinguished, confident, the very image of medical authority. Nothing in his demeanor suggested a man who had spent 30 years stealing babies from their mothers. The surgery concluded, and Dr. Reeves stepped away from the table, pulling off his gloves with practiced efficiency. The observation gallery began to empty, board members and administrators filing out with satisfied murmurs about another successful procedure. But Angela moved against the flow, heading for the surgical suite doors. "Dr. Reeves," she called as he emerged, still in scrubs, "we need to speak with you about your obstetrics practice." His expression shifted subtly, the confident smile becoming more guarded. "Angela, I wasn't aware you'd transferred to surgical rotation." "I haven't. This is about the babies, doctor. The ones you've been stealing." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the surgical corridor continued its normal rhythm, nurses wheeling equipment, residents discussing cases. But Sarah felt the world contract to this moment, this confrontation. Dr. Reeves glanced around, assessing who could hear, who might be recording. His eyes found Sarah, and recognition flashed across his features. "Miss Chen, I was wondering when you'd surface. The police have been quite concerned about your mental state." "The police work for you," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt, "just like everyone else in this hospital." "That's a serious accusation." His tone remained professional, but Sarah caught the calculation behind his eyes. He was already planning, deciding how much danger they represented, how they could be neutralized. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No more privacy," Angela said firmly. "No more back rooms and buried reports. This ends in public, with witnesses." She opened the folder, displaying the photographs for anyone nearby to see. Birth certificates, medical records, hospital bracelets, 30 years of evidence spread across the surgical corridor like an indictment. Dr. Reeves barely glanced at the documents, but his face had gone pale beneath the surgical lights. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. These arrangements, they serve families who couldn't otherwise." "Steal babies," Sarah interrupted, her 8 months of terror crystallizing into rage. "You steal babies and sell them. You tell mothers their children died and then traffic them to wealthy couples willing to pay for silence." "You're overwrought," he said, reaching toward her with the same condescending gesture he'd used during their first meeting. "Pregnancy can cause—" Sarah stepped back, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. "Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me." The surgical corridor had gone quiet, staff members stopping to stare at the confrontation unfolding before them. Sarah could see recognition dawning on several faces, nurses and residents who had worked with Dr. Reeves, who had noticed irregularities but never connected the pieces. "Security," Dr. Reeves said quietly into his phone. "Surgical floor. Psychiatric emergency." But Angela was already moving, distributing copies of the evidence to the gathering crowd of medical staff. "Look at the dates," she called out. "Look at the signatures. 30 years of falsified death certificates, all bearing Dr. Reeves's name." The final battle had begun, and there would be no retreat. The security guards arrived within minutes, but they found themselves facing something unprecedented. A surgical corridor full of medical staff examining evidence, their faces ranging from shock to recognition to long-suppressed understanding. Dr. Reeves stood in the center of it all, his authority crumbling as 30 years of systematic crimes laid bare under fluorescent lights. "These people are delusional," he told the guards, but his voice lacked conviction. "Hospital policy clearly states—" "Hospital policy doesn't cover baby trafficking," Angela interrupted, holding up a birth certificate. Dr. Martinez here has been investigating the disappearances. Show them the ultrasound photos, Doctor. Sarah reached into the folder with shaking hands, pulling out the ultrasound images she'd memorized over sleepless nights. Her daughter chose that moment to kick hard, a reminder of what victory would cost. Because looking at the faces around them, nurses she recognized from her own prenatal appointments, residents who rotated through obstetrics, Sarah realized the terrible truth. She could never give birth at this hospital. Not now, not after this confrontation. Dr. Reeves might be exposed, but his network ran deeper than one man. How many of these concerned faces would transform back into institutional loyalty once the immediate shock faded? How many would choose their careers over her safety? The pattern is clear, Angela continued, addressing the crowd rather than the increasingly desperate Dr. Reeves. Vulnerable mothers, isolated deliveries, falsified death certificates, and always the same financial irregularities in billing. Dr. Reeves lunged forward, trying to grab the folder, but the security guards restrained him instead of Sarah. The evidence was too public now. Too many witnesses, too much institutional exposure for the conspiracy to protect him through violence. "You don't understand," he snarled at Sarah, his professional mask finally slipping. "These babies went to better families, families who could provide, families who could pay," Sarah corrected, her voice carrying across the corridor. "You stole children and sold them to the highest bidders." The security guards were talking into their radios now, calling for hospital administration, legal department, outside authorities. The conspiracy's protective walls were collapsing, but Sarah felt no triumph, only the crushing weight of what she was sacrificing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Sarah, please, come home. We can protect you and the baby." But home meant Dr. Reeves's reach. Home meant delivering her daughter into the same system that had stolen 37 other babies. Home meant trusting institutions that had already proven themselves corrupt. Angela was distributing more evidence, her voice growing stronger as the crowd of medical staff grew larger. The billing records show payments from private adoption agencies, amounts far exceeding normal medical fees. And look at the timing. These stillbirths always occurred during Dr. Reeves's solo shifts. Dr. Reeves made one final desperate play. "This woman is mentally unstable," he announced loudly. "She's been stalking hospital staff, making threats against her unborn child. Her pregnancy has clearly triggered severe psychological—" Enough. The voice came from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the hospital's chief of staff, who had arrived with a team of administrators and legal counsel. She looked at the evidence spread across the floor, then at Dr. Reeves's face, and made the calculation that would define careers and legal liability for years to come. "Dr. Reeves, you're suspended pending investigation. Security, please escort him from the building." But as the guards moved to comply, Sarah realized her victory was Pyrrhic. The system was protecting itself, not pursuing justice. Dr. Reeves would be quietly removed, the scandal contained, the network preserved under different leadership. In a few months, after the media attention faded, it would all resume under another name. "The babies," Sarah said desperately as Dr. Reeves was led away. "The 37 children from the storage unit boxes. They're still out there, still with families who bought them illegally." Dr. Morrison's expression tightened. "Miss Chen, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but making accusations about adopted children is—" "Not accusations. Proof." Sarah held up the folder one final time. DNA evidence linking these babies to mothers who never consented to adoption. Financial records showing illegal payments. Medical documents proving systematic fraud. Around her, the crowd of medical staff began to disperse, returning to their duties now that the immediate drama was over. The institutional reflex toward normalcy was already reasserting itself, swallowing the evidence of systematic horror into bureaucratic processes that would take years to produce any real justice. Angela touched Sarah's arm gently. "You did it. You exposed him." But Sarah was looking at her phone, at messages from her landlord about eviction notices, from her business partner about final bankruptcy proceedings, from Marcus pleading for her return. She had won the battle and lost everything else: her home, her business, her safety, her support network. Her daughter kicked again, and Sarah pressed her hand to her belly, making the final calculation. She could never go home. The hospital corridor buzzed with whispered conversations as administrators huddled with legal counsel, their voices carrying fragments of damage control strategy. Sarah stood at the center of it all, feeling increasingly invisible as the institutional machinery ground into motion around her. She had expected vindication to feel different, more like triumph, less like dissolution. "Miss Chen." Dr. Morrison approached with the careful distance of someone navigating liability. "We'll need you to provide a formal statement to our investigators. Your cooperation in this matter has been noted." The clinical phrasing made Sarah's skin crawl. 37 stolen babies reduced to a matter. Her months of terror and investigation dismissed as mere cooperation. She watched Dr. Morrison's face, searching for any genuine horror at what had been revealed, finding only administrative calculation. "What about the families?" Sarah pressed. "The children who are living with people who bought them illegally?" "That's a complex legal question involving multiple jurisdictions, and they were stolen." Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion. "Those babies were stolen from their mothers and sold. The families who have them now are victims too, but the children will be handled through appropriate channels." Dr. Morrison's tone suggested the conversation was over. "I'm sure you understand our priority must be ensuring this never happens again." But Sarah understood something different. The hospital's priority was containing liability, managing public relations, and protecting institutional reputation. The actual victims, mothers who had grieved phantom dead babies for decades, children who didn't know their own identities, families built on purchased lies, would be secondary to organizational survival. Angela appeared at her elbow, having finished distributing evidence to the remaining staff members. "Come on," she murmured. "Let's get you out of here before they decide you're a continued threat." As they walked toward the elevators, Sarah caught fragments of the conversations following in their wake. Nurses discussing which cases they'd found suspicious. Residents wondering if they should report concerns to outside authorities. A few administrators already crafting explanatory statements about isolated incidents and rogue physicians. "How many?" Sarah asked Angela as the elevator doors closed. "How many people knew something was wrong but never spoke up?" Angela's reflection in the polished steel doors showed decades of institutional weight, more than should have. Fewer than could have made a difference if we'd organized sooner. She paused. "That's the real victory here, Sarah. Not just exposing Reeves, but breaking the silence, making it impossible for people to pretend they don't see." In the parking garage, the desert heat hit them like a physical force. Sarah's pregnancy made the temperature even more oppressive, and her daughter responded with restless movement that suggested shared discomfort. Everything felt suspended in the shimmering air, the victory, the consequences, the uncertain future stretching ahead. "Where will you go?" Angela asked, walking Sarah to her car. The question Sarah had been avoiding crystallized into necessity. Marcus wanted her back in Portland, but Portland meant Dr. Reeves's contacts and influence. Her business in Tucson was finished, her apartment lost, her savings depleted by months of investigation. She had exposed a conspiracy, but destroyed her own stability in the process. "I don't know." The admission felt like failure. Somewhere they can't reach. Somewhere I can have my daughter safely. Angela pulled a business card from her pocket, writing on the back. "My cousin runs a clinic in Flagstaff, independent practice, no hospital affiliations. She's dealt with women fleeing domestic violence, undocumented immigrants, people who need care outside the system. If you decide to stay in Arizona..." Sarah took the card, recognizing it as both lifeline and admission of defeat. She had imagined justice looking different, official, institutional, complete. Instead, It looked like starting over in a strange city, trusting her daughter's birth to people she'd never met, building a new life from the fragments of everything she'd sacrificed. Her phone buzzed with another message from Marcus. "The Portland police want to interview you about the storage unit. The FBI is getting involved." "Sarah, you started something bigger than you realize." Bigger than she realized, but smaller than she'd hoped. The federal investigation would take years, if it proceeded at all. The stolen children were adults now, scattered across the country, living lives built on lies they might never learn. The families who had unknowingly purchased them would fight to keep the only children they'd ever known. Justice would be complex, incomplete, probably unsatisfying. But in the surgical corridor, surrounded by evidence of systematic horror, something had broken. The silence that had protected Dr. Reeves and his network for 30 years was shattered. Other victims would come forward. Other conspirators would be exposed. The institutional protection that had made the trafficking possible was cracking, slowly but irreversibly. Sarah's daughter kicked again, more gently this time, as if sensing her mother's resolve crystallizing. They couldn't go home, but they could go forward, into uncertainty, into a future built on the ruins of everything Sarah had lost, but also into freedom from the conspiracy that had threatened to claim them both. The victory was partial, painful, and bought at a price Sarah was still calculating, but it was real, the return. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the doorway of a small apartment in Flagstaff, watching snow dust the San Francisco peaks through windows that actually closed properly. Her daughter Maya slept in a second-hand crib nearby, wrapped in blankets that had been gifts rather than purchases, evidence of the unexpected community that had formed around them in this mountain town where nobody asked too many questions about your past. The phone in her hand buzzed with Marcus's latest update. He'd been calling weekly since Maya's birth, each conversation a careful negotiation between the life Sarah had abandoned and the one she was building from scratch. Reeves pleaded guilty, his voice carried across the distance between Arizona and Oregon. 15 years, but he's cooperating. The FBI says there are at least 6 other doctors involved, maybe more adoption agencies. Sarah, you broke this thing wide open. She traced patterns in the frost on the window, thinking of the storage unit boxes that had started everything. What about the families? The children? It's messy. Some of the kids want to find their birth parents. Others are fighting the investigation, saying they don't want their lives destroyed by ancient crimes. The courts are struggling with how to handle it all. Sarah understood. Justice, she'd learned, was rarely clean or complete. It was mostly just the slow, complicated work of people deciding to tell truth instead of protecting convenient lies. "How are you doing?" Marcus asked, the question loaded with months of careful concern. Sarah looked around the apartment, sparse but clean, functional but not yet home. Angela's cousin had delivered Maya in a birthing center that smelled like lavender instead of antiseptic, with midwives who knew nothing of Dr. Reeves or stolen babies or conspiracy. Just 2 women bringing a healthy child into the world, which turned out to be miracle enough. "Different," she said finally. "I'm different than I was." It was true in ways both profound and mundane. She'd learned to ask for help, accepting assistance from neighbors and social services without the pride that had nearly destroyed her in Tucson. She'd learned to trust her instincts about people and institutions, reading the subtle signs that indicated safety or threat. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes walking away from everything you know is the only path to protecting everything you love. "I started a support group," she told Marcus, "for mothers who've lost children to illegal adoption. Word travels, even up here. 3 women so far, all with stories that sound familiar. The work was harder than running a vintage boutique, less profitable than selling curated clothes to tourists, but it felt like purpose in a way her previous life never had. Each woman who shared her story weakened the silence that made trafficking possible. Each testimony became evidence, each connection proof that the conspiracy's victims were not isolated or powerless. Maya stirred in her crib, making the soft sounds that meant feeding time was approaching. At 3 months old, she was healthy and alert, untouched by the violence that had surrounded her gestation. Sarah had been terrified during pregnancy that stress and trauma might somehow mark her daughter, but Maya seemed determined to be her own person, curious about the world, patient with her mother's inexperience, surprisingly adaptable to their nomadic circumstances. "The storage unit company is being investigated too," Marcus continued. "Turns out they were paid to stage that auction, make sure the boxes went to someone who wouldn't ask questions. You were supposed to be an easy mark, pregnant, desperate, focused on finding vintage inventory rather than investigating medical records." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Her desperation had made her the perfect target, but also the perfect investigator. Someone more stable, more financially secure, might have called the police immediately and let the system handle everything. Someone with less to lose might not have been willing to risk everything for truth. "I'm thinking about writing a book," she said, surprised by the admission. "About the investigation, the conspiracy, what it means when institutions fail to protect children. That's good, important. Your story needs to be told." But Sarah was thinking beyond her own story. The real narrative belonged to the stolen children, the grieving mothers, the families who'd unknowingly built lives on purchased lies. Her role was just catalyst, the pregnant woman who'd opened the wrong storage unit and refused to close it again. Through the window, she could see other apartments in the complex, other lives continuing their normal rhythms. Families cooking dinner, children playing in snow, people who'd never heard of Dr. Reeves or surgical conspiracies or stolen babies. Sarah envied their innocence while recognizing she could never return to it. Maya began crying in earnest now, the particular wail that meant immediate attention was required. Sarah ended the call with Marcus and lifted her daughter, feeling the solid weight of this child who belonged entirely to herself. No conspiracy, no institutional claim, no question of ownership or legitimacy. "We're safe," she whispered into Maya's soft hair. "We're free." It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen. And for the first time since finding those storage unit boxes, that felt like enough. As Maya settled into nursing, Sarah felt the familiar tug of connection that still amazed her after 3 months. This simple act, feeding her daughter, represented everything the conspiracy had tried to steal from other mothers. The weight of that knowledge had softened over time, transforming from sharp grief into something more manageable, purpose. The afternoon light filtering through the Flagstaff snow cast everything in soft focus, making the small apartment feel almost dreamlike. Sarah had grown to love these quiet moments when the world contracted to just herself and Maya, when the larger questions of justice and healing could wait. A knock at the door interrupted the peaceful scene. Sarah checked the peephole to find Carmen, one of the women from her support group, holding a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone who needed to talk. "I brought green chili stew," Carmen said when Sarah opened the door, and Maria called. She found her daughter. Sarah's breath caught. Maria had been searching for 18 months since learning her supposedly stillborn baby had actually been stolen and sold. The investigation had provided leads but no certainties, no guarantees that the stolen children wanted to be found. How is she handling it? Better than expected. Turns out her daughter, Anna now, had been looking for her birth mother too. She's 31, married, has kids of her own. They're going to meet next week. Carmen settled into the second-hand armchair Sarah had found at a thrift store, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that still trembled slightly when discussing the conspiracy. She'd been one of Dr. Reeves's patients in the early days, told her son had died during delivery. Learning he was alive and living 2 states away had shattered and rebuilt her simultaneously. "It makes you think," Carmen continued, "about all the stories we don't know yet, all the families still living with lies." Sarah shifted Maya to her shoulder, patting gently until a satisfied burp emerged. "The FBI agent called yesterday. They've identified 43 stolen babies now, spanning 12 years. But he thinks there were more, maybe many more." The scope continued to expand as investigators dug deeper. What had seemed like an isolated conspiracy centered on Dr. Reeves was revealing itself as part of a broader network involving multiple hospitals, adoption agencies, and legal professionals. Sarah sometimes felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what her storage unit discovery had uncovered. "Are you still planning to testify at the Senate hearing?" Carmen asked. Sarah nodded. Senator Patricia Williams had announced hearings on illegal adoption practices, using Dr. Reeves's case as the centerpiece for broader legislative reform. Sarah had been invited to share her story, representing both the victims and the accidental investigators who'd exposed the truth. "Maya and I will fly to Washington next month. It feels important, even if nothing concrete comes from it." The truth was that Sarah had learned to measure victory in smaller increments. Each woman who joined their support group represented progress. Each news story that mentioned the stolen babies kept the issue visible. Each day that Maya grew healthy and safe in Flagstaff was proof that they'd escaped the conspiracy's reach. Carmen stayed for an hour, sharing updates from other members of their growing network. Women across the country were coming forward with similar stories, connecting through social media and legal advocates, building the community of witnesses that made systematic denial impossible. After Carmen left, Sarah found herself looking through the box she kept on the closet shelf. Not medical records this time, but letters from other mothers, photos of recovered children, newspaper clippings about the ongoing investigations, evidence of impact, of change rippling outward from that sweltering Tucson garage where she'd first opened a white box and discovered the impossible. Maya had fallen asleep in her arms, tiny features peaceful in the mountain light. Sarah studied her daughter's face, seeing neither Marcus nor herself, but someone entirely new, a person who would grow up knowing the truth about institutional power and personal courage, who would inherit a world slightly more honest than the one Sarah had known. The phone buzzed with a text from Angela. "Dr. Morrison resigned today. New chief of staff is ordering complete review of delivery records going back 20 years. Change is happening. Slow change, imperfect change, but change nonetheless." Sarah had learned that justice wasn't a destination but a direction, the accumulated result of people choosing courage over comfort, truth over convenience, action over silence. As evening settled over Flagstaff, Sarah prepared Maya's bedtime routine with the confidence of someone who'd found her rhythm. The uncertainty remained: financial struggles, legal complications, the ongoing work of healing from trauma, but underneath it all was something solid, the knowledge that she'd protected her daughter and helped protect others. Standing in the nursery doorway, watching Maya sleep in the crib surrounded by gifts from their new community, Sarah whispered the words that had become her evening prayer: "We're safe, we're free, we made it through." Outside, snow continued falling on the peaks, covering the landscape in clean white. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to peace, hard-won, carefully guarded, absolutely real. It was enough. They were enough. This life, built from the wreckage of everything she'd lost, was finally completely enough.